Sir, in order to save yourself from the impending storm that now threatens you, I order you to surrender yourself with all your garrison, stores, etc., etc., etc. For I am obliged to storm. You may depend on such treatment as is justly due to a murderer. Beware of destroying stores of any kind, or any papers or letters that are in your possession. For by heavens, if you do, there shall be no mercy shown to you. Signed, George Rogers Clark.
This letter was given to Governor Hamilton in Fort Sackville. Hamilton eventually surrenders to Colonel Clark, ending the Battle of Vincennes. Clark and his men fought bravely during the Battle for Vincennes, but it was the journey there that proved the strength and determination of Clark and his men. Behind me is the George Rogers Clark Memorial, commemorating the Revolutionary War victory that happened here, which secured the gateway to the Northwest Territory. Let's go inside and talk to a ranger about Clark's perilous journey. I'm here with Ranger Jason Collins to ask him a couple questions. Can you describe the journey that George Rogers Clark took with all of his men?
I can. In fact, I'll actually draw your attention to that third mural right over there because I think that really sums it up well. So the whole reason for George Rogers Clark coming here in 1779 was the fact that the British had retaken Fort Sackville. And when they had come here, they had come here with about 500 soldiers. But they knew that once wintertime comes, you stopped fighting. That's when you get resupplied, you wait for the spring when everything warms up and thaws out, and that's when you go on the attack again. So the British, they don't want to feed 500 people, so they send most of those soldiers home and they'll stay here with a small army. So George Rogers Clark, you can see him there in that mural. He's the guy with the gun hanging over his head. He finds all this out, and he decides that he's got two options. He can stay where he was in Kaskaskia, knowing that the British are going to come and attack him in the spring when it warms up. Or he can risk everything. He can march overland 180 miles in February, knowing all that land is flooded swamp, to come and attack Vincennes. So the march is going to take George Rogers Clark about 180 miles, about 18 days worth of marching. In the last 10 days, they're going to spend that in water, chest and neck deep. And Clark's writing about chunks of ice along the shoreline. He says they were about 1/2 to 3/4 inch thick. And those guys also go without food for the last 3 days of the march. And when they get to the Wabash River, they actually find that it's no longer a river, but it's a big lake about 4 miles across. But the problem was they only had a couple of boats. So when you think about the time of year that we're talking about in February, can you imagine swimming in a swimming pool in February?
Yeah.
Probably not at all, right? Not even in a heated pool. So these men, they start to find logs, branches, because they only had 2 boats. So basically they would use anything that floated to be able to get across. And if you look in that mural right there, if you look in the bottom left corner, you can see the drummer boy there. The story that George Rogers Clark tells, that the drummer boy used his drum as a flotation device to be able to float his way across. So they get across the river and they find they're about 10 miles from Vincennes. But the problems are just starting. All of the land between where they crossed and here, that was all swampy too. So basically what they have to do is go from one little piece of muddy ground to another at night. And they're all the while trying to keep quiet, trying to make sure nobody here in Vincennes, nobody here in the fort knows what's going on. And Clark's strategy now, he's gotten all of his men here. He wants to give the illusion that he's brought a huge army to fight the British. So as they start walking closer to the village, they start flying flags. And the British knew that for every flag they counted, that meant about 50 men. So Clark brought enough flags to make it seem like he had brought a huge army. The British thought it was somewhere between 500 and 1,000 men. So the battle here, once they actually got here, was very, very short, about 1 day's worth. And then on the 25th of February, the British surrendered the fort over to George Rogers Clark.
So another question that I have is, what were they wearing?
What were they wearing? That's an excellent question. And I want to give you two examples. I first want to draw you to the Clark statue right here, so you'll see one idea of how he was dressed. And then I want to draw you back to that mural back there. Is he wearing the same kind of clothes in both paintings? Not even close, right? So what you see in our statue, that's more of an idealized image of what he would have been wearing. Something like George Washington would have wore, for example. But the way you see him in that mural back there and all these other murals, we believe that's how he would have been dressed. The men wore a lot of linen, which helps you stay nice and cool in the summer, but also helps you keep warm in the winter. They also wore a lot of wool. Wool is nice for the winter because it's nice and thick, but you really don't want to wear a lot of it in the summer months because it's a very heavy fabric. And then you can kind of draw yourself all the way down. He's wearing mostly linen, and you can see his hat right there in the other murals here. That hat was made out of beaver fur, and there's a really important reason for that. Do beavers like the water?
Yeah.
So when that hat gets wet, and helps to keep your own head dry, but it also helps to keep the sun out of your eyes too. So we always like to think about these men wearing like a lot of leather and all of that, but the men who would have been walking here with the George Rogers Clark would have been wearing more linen, more wool, and people always want to know, they're going through all of this water for all these days. How did they stay dry? Clark's men carried bear fat, bear grease, and they would put that all over their clothes. Kind of sounds gross, right?
Yeah.
But that bear grease is a waterproofing agent. So by having that all over your body, that allows you to not only keep warm, but also to, very importantly, keep dry. Because when you're traveling 180 miles, you want to make sure that what you're carrying is as light as possible, because you can't just stop at the corner store and get more clothes. But whatever you're going to have, you're going to carry on your back. So they want to have as little as possible. So that bear grease was vital in being able to keep them warm during all this water.
Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So right now I am on a levee right next to the Wabash River. It would not have been here in George Rogers Clark's time period, and all of this land would have been flooded. Right now I'm at a tributary to the Wabash River. The conditions now are similar to the conditions that George Rogers Clark and his men would have to go through. Temperature is 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, for Clark, this would have been rainy and overcast the whole time. Now, from Clark's account, in his regiment there was a drummer boy, and sometimes the water was so deep he'd have to float on his drum. So if he can do it, I can do it. Now I'm going to go step into the tributary in the Wabash River. Ready? Oh, this is cold. And I can relate to them. I can't feel my legs anymore. Okay. They had to do my legs are in pain. They had to do this the whole time. Nope. Oh, it's cold. Okay. can't feel my legs right now. I can't believe Clark and his men had to do this for multiple days. If I had some bear fat, maybe I could have lasted longer.